30 through 44, I'm sure you've picked up on a repeated theme throughout the Gospel of Mark, and that is that Jesus is not just a prophet, he's not even just the Messiah, but he is a king. And not just any king, he is the King of kings, the Lord of lords, the King of all the universe. Well, I don't know if we if we as Americans really associate a king as a political figure that's just so detached from our reality, but I would imagine that for many of Mark's original readers, they would hear of Jesus being a king, and that would maybe give them a negative perception of him, that he would kind of be guilty by association, that there might be an assumption or a bias against kings, that, well, if Jesus is a king, that's not good news because there are no good kings. Maybe we would think of it more along the politicians, along the lines of politicians. Oh, he's a politician. There's no such thing as a good politician, right? Or, I don't know, sometimes we just group people into one category. There's no such thing as a good Alabama fan, right? I mean, we can kind of just put people into categories. And so people, that was an easy joke. To be honest, I don't know anything about sports. So, but we maybe have a negative bias against politicians, right? And so maybe some of Mark's original readers, when they hear that Jesus is not just a rabbi or a teacher or a prophet, but he's a king, maybe that makes them biased against him. And so as we continue to study through the Gospel of Mark, we need to learn not only that Jesus is a king, but we need to see that Jesus is a good king. That he's the kind of king that we would want to live under his rule and his reign. And so we have in today's passage a direct contrast between who King Jesus is compared to who King Herod was. That's what we studied last week. We learned about King Herod's dinner party, and we learned about all the wickedness that happened there and all that Herod did, and that would maybe lead us to think how there's no such thing as a good king. But what we learn about King Jesus is that he's not just a good king, but he's also a good shepherd. That as we look at the text today, Jesus' compassion for the people, it was inspired in him because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And that led him to be compassionate for them, to act and to stand in as their good shepherd. Well, once again, this might be a metaphor that is somewhat detached from our day-to-day lives. What's wrong with being a sheep without a shepherd? Well, sheep are defenseless. I mean, if you think about it, without a shepherd, they have no hope of survival. They're not fast. They don't have sharp teeth. They don't have claws or fangs. They don't have shells. They don't even like a skunk have an ability to stink or anything like that. They have no self-defense. And on top of that, they're not smart. I had one teacher who was I guess she's a shepherdess. She's a woman. And she said that sheep are so dumb that if you line them up in a line and you walk them, you lead them in a line, they'll follow each other in that line. Even you can lead the first one off of a cliff and they will one by one follow in line off the cliff. Now, I cannot confirm that to you personally, but this is what this teacher told me, okay? So defenseless, no way to attack or to defend, and not even smart. That essentially, without a shepherd, sheep are dead. And so, I don't know if you realize this, but we, in the Bible, are routinely described as the sheep. So this is not very flattering for us, to be honest. I mean, Jesus, you could have called us something else, right? No, in the Bible, we are the sheep. It's not flattering for us, but it is accurate of who Jesus is. It's accurate of our total dependence upon him. It's accurate in describing our need of him. And so the apostles, the disciples, are going to be reminded of this truth as they are returning from the mission field. You'll remember that we had Missions 101, and the disciples were sent out to bring the gospel to the neighboring towns. And now they've returned back, and that is where we pick up in verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. Now, this is really interesting because this is already a pretty major departure from the traditional rabbi-disciple relationship, which Jesus has already done plenty of things to break the expectations. But typically, if you are a disciple, you are training under your rabbi until the age of 30, at which point you go out and you become your own rabbi, and you bring your own disciples to you and you train them up. And that's how the process goes on. But what happens with Jesus' disciples is though they are sent out, they always come back. Meaning they never graduate, they never go on to make disciples of Peter or disciples of Andrew. We as disciples of Jesus are always making more disciples of Jesus. And we as disciples of Jesus, no matter how old we become or how mature we become, we always return back to the feet of our teacher. And so that is what the disciples are doing here. They've been sent out, and there was even success while they were out on mission for Jesus, but they returned back to him. And this is what he said to them in verse 31. He said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And so they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves." So here, Jesus recognizes in his disciples a weariness, that they are tired, that they are exhausted, that they have been out serving him and attempting to build the kingdom, and he sees in them that they were so busy that they did not have any time for physical rest, even the leisure to eat, let alone the ability to rest spiritually and to recharge. And so what's important to notice is that he does not send them away by themselves, but he sends them away with him, that they go together to find a place to rest. And so as we are learning about who this King Jesus is, what kind of a king he is, the first thing that we see is that Jesus has compassion for your exhausted spirit, that Christ has compassion for your exhausted spirit. That the disciples had been serving and they had worn themselves ragged, and Christ, when they came back, didn't say, well, drink some more coffee and get back to work. He said, no, come away, let's go away, and you need to find some time to rest. Most importantly, not just physical rest, not just a good meal, but rest with him, in him. It makes me think of a time when as I think about this idea of true rest. There's lots of different ways that we can find rest. I even think in this word leisure here, we see the idea that the disciples and Jesus are going to enjoy some bro time. Like I think out in the desert, in the wilderness, they're like, hey, let's get away from the noise and the crowds and let's enjoy each other and enjoy a break. So I do think that's part of what Jesus is saying. But more importantly than bro time, the disciples are going to find rest, true rest in Jesus. And when I think of this concept of true rest, it reminds me of a time when Meg and I were dating. We were engaged, I think, and we were doing the whole circuit of before you have your own family, you have to see everybody on Christmas break. So you got to go to this family, and that family, and this family, and that family. Well, that was really hard for us because Meg was at school in New Orleans, her family's in Alabama, my family's in Kentucky. So it was a lot of traveling. And I remember we were going home to see my family for Christmas, and we got on the last highway, about the last hour of the trip. We'd already been driving for a long, long time. It was already very late, and a huge snowstorm hit. Now, those of you who actually grew up here in the deep south, this is terrifying for you. And a lot of people who grew up where it snows, you're like, it's just another day. But this bad snowstorm hits to where I really had to slow down. My visibility is very low. It covers the road bad enough that I can't see lines. I can't really see where the road ends and the ditch begins. And so the last hour turned into more like the last 3 hours because I was trying to be cautious. And my whole plan was there were tracks in front of me. I couldn't see the car in front of me, but I could see the tracks in front of me. And I thought, well, if I come across a car in a ditch, I'll stop. But if not, I'll just keep following the tracks. And just Meg was sound asleep, so it didn't really bother her, but I remember like gripping that wheel so tight and just my shoulders being so tense and being so tired, and the night just went on and on and on, and just being so exhausted. And then finally, we made it home to the home I grew up in, to a warm bed and a family that I love and a safe place. And I just remember the exhaustion and the weariness and the stress just kind of melting away in that moment as we pull in the driveway and the light is on and we get to go in and we get to be home. Well, this is a picture of the kind of rest that Jesus is offering to every single one of us. But even this picture, as hallmarky as it is, falls short of what Jesus is truly offering to us. He called the disciples away from their noise of their lives. He called the disciples away from even the busyness of ministry and called them to rest in his presence. And he is calling to each and every one of us to find the same rest. Yes, of course, we find rest in many different leisure activities. Maybe it's the show that you like to watch at night, or it's your hobby on the weekends, or maybe it's your bro time. Those are all good things and good opportunities to find physical or mental rest, but you won't find true rest in those things. You only find true rest in the presence of Jesus. And so what I hope you see in this is not a guilt trip. Well, great, I'm already exhausted, and here's one more thing I have to do, is find time to rest in Jesus. Instead, I want you to hear in this an offer from Jesus. He said in Matthew chapter 11, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." So this isn't one more thing that you need to add to your to-do list. This is the one place where you will find true rest. I kind of think of, I've only ever heard this phrase from like pretentious sounding celebrities, so forgive me if you use this phrase, but sleep hygiene, where they talk about like, hey, what's your sleep hygiene? Hey, what's your sleep hygiene? And they go through this big long list of all these steps that they take so that they know they're gonna get the best quality sleep at night. And it's about taking their health seriously, right? It's like, well, there's no screens 2 hours prior to when I sleep, and there's no caffeine, and this big long list, right? And I'm gonna meditate for 10 minutes, and it's this big long list of all the things they're gonna do so they can get good sleep at night. And I almost imagine the way that we shy away from true rest in Jesus is like your list of items on your sleep hygiene is so long that by the time you get to the end of it, the night is over, and you don't get to sleep. Well, that's what we're doing when we think of resting in Jesus as one more thing to do, one more item on our to-do list. And we've got our list entirely backwards and opposite and upside down. Jesus is not trying to guilt trip you into one more thing to add to your day. He's trying to offer to you the only place where you will find true rest. That him calling the disciples away was not part of the routine of them becoming trained rabbis. It was inspired by his compassion, that he saw their weariness, and he was compassionate for them. And Jesus sees our weariness. He sees when we get our life out of order. He sees when the to-do lists take over. He sees when our spirits are exhausted. He sees when we find rest in all the wrong places. He's compassionate for that. And so he calls to us. This is the kind of king I am. This is the kind of shepherd I am. I want you to find in me true rest. And so that is Jesus' intention in calling the disciples away. But unfortunately, as we keep reading, they don't get that opportunity to bro out like they had hoped. Look at verses 33 and 34. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So I don't know exactly logistically how this worked out. The disciples and Jesus are getting on a boat and they're headed to a desolate place. Somehow word gets out. They know where they're headed, and they actually rush and they get there ahead of them. So they intend to show up for this time of rest, and the crowds have beat them to the desolate place. You would think maybe at first Jesus would be like, all right, guys, enough is enough. We need a break. You guys head back home. But that's not what Jesus does. Verse 34. And when he, meaning Jesus, went ashore, he saw the great crowd, and he had compassion on them. Why? Because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. This phrase, sheep without a shepherd, is a direct reference to the Old Testament. It is describing Moses passing the mantle to Joshua, and him saying, I do not want the people of God to be like a sheep without shepherd. And so as I am passing away, you, Joshua, will be the new leader of God's people. And interestingly, you don't catch this in English because of the tradition of how it's all been translated, but in Hebrew, Jesus and Joshua are the same name. We've just translated one from Hebrew to English and one from Greek to English, and so they sound different, but they are identical names. And so to say that Jesus is going to be the shepherd of God's people so that they are not sheep without a shepherd is to directly say that Jesus is following in the line of Joshua. As we think about the book of Hebrews, well, the way that Jesus is described over and over and over is the one who is better than. Meaning, yes, Joshua was able to provide a kind of rest for God's people because he led them in a military victory into the promised land. But Jesus can provide an even greater and even truer rest for God's people because he does not lead them into a physical promised land. He leads them into God's kingdom, an eternal promised land. So all of that is said in that one little phrase that Yeshua is the one who will keep the people from being like a sheep without a shepherd. He will be the good shepherd for God's people. Notice that his compassion led him to teach them many things. I think that's important. If you're familiar with this passage, you know what is coming. Jesus is about to do a miracle. He's going to feed these hungry people. But his compassion first, before he even feeds their empty stomachs, is to feed their eternal souls. And so we see, secondly, here what kind of king Jesus is, that Christ has compassion for your eternal soul. Christ has compassion for your eternal soul. That his act of teaching was an act of compassion. We talked about this last week. Don't let the world convince you that preaching the gospel is an act of hate. It is an act of compassion. It is offensive. But it is much more hateful to not offend somebody and let them go to hell. And so Jesus, in his compassion, he preaches the gospel to the people, and we see that what kind of king he is. He cares for our exhausted spirits, and he cares for our eternal souls. So we see Jesus ministering to these people in multiple different ways. Yes, he is wanting them to get recharged and filled back up for ministry, but that's not all. It would be as if you think you're taking good care of your car just because you fill up the tank. Well, taking care of a car requires more. Teenagers, I need you to know, if you don't know, taking care of a car requires more than filling up the tank. You can keep that tank as full as it can get all the time, but if you never change the oil, you're headed for trouble. And so even though Jesus wants us to find rest in him, he offers to us much more than topping off our tank. He doesn't want to just give us energy for our exhausted spirit. He wants to give us eternal life. He wants to be the shepherd for your sheep soul. Without Jesus, our souls are as weak and as helpless and as desperate as any sheep. That is really what the picture is communicating, that we are destined for spiritual death in the same way that a sheep without a shepherd is destined for death. That's how helpless we are without him. Maybe you've heard of Shrek the sheep. I'd say he's one of the two most famous sheep. There's Shrek the sheep, and what was the first one that got cloned? Dolly? Was that Dolly the sheep? So two famous sheep in my lifetime. Dolly, and here's Shrek. Here's a picture of Shrek. Maybe you've heard of him. Shrek got famous in 2004 because he, for whatever reason, kind of escaped the herd and secretly hid away in caves for 6 years by himself. And the shepherd just assumed that what happened to most sheep happened to Shrek, that if one gets away, they got eaten or killed in some way. But somehow, Shrek was the exception to the rule. Most sheep by themselves die. But here is a pretty clear demonstration that even though Shrek had managed to scrape by and live for 6 years, he wasn't exactly in a good spot, was he? He had, 60 pounds of wool, enough to make 20 suits for men. And so even though Shrek is the exception, he's still not doing great. Most of us wouldn't have lasted the 6 years, right? All right, you can get rid of Shrek. He's kind of distracting. Okay, thank you. Most sheep, when they are by themselves without a shepherd, don't even end up in that good of a situation, which was not a good situation. Why? They have no way of defending themselves, protecting themselves. They are helpless and hopeless without a shepherd. Our souls are in the exact same situation. We are just as needy, just as dependent upon our good shepherd. And Jesus is a good shepherd. He has compassion, not just when we're physically exhausted, but he wants to give to us eternal life. This is why he willingly took the punishment for sin upon himself. That's what he did. That's what his mission was. Yes, he came and he taught many good things. Yes, he came and he performed miracles, but at the end of the day, his mission, his purpose was to go to the cross. Because on the cross, he willingly took the full wrath of God upon himself, the punishment for every sin of all time, upon himself, so that a great exchange could take place, so that we could receive his perfection, his holiness, and his righteousness, and he could take our sin and our wrath and our punishment. This was Jesus' mission. And this was how he was ultimately the good shepherd. This is how he demonstrated the greatest act of compassion for your eternal soul, was by being willing to do that for you. And so we've seen already, this is a pretty good king. He has compassion for our exhausted spirit, compassion for our eternal soul. And now let's finish out our verses for this morning. Verse 35. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." Now, really, this is kind of just a common sense suggestion. They're out in the middle of the wilderness. That's what the desolate place, you can translate that to wilderness. There's no resources to feed them. And the people are looking to Jesus as their leader in this moment. So Jesus, let's send them away so they can go and take care of themselves. Maybe they can find something to eat if they go into the surrounding villages. Verse 37. But he, Jesus, answered them, "You give them something to eat." Now, this is, at surface level, a ridiculous thing to say, Jesus. How in the world could we possibly do this? But we have to keep in mind who Jesus is and what, up to this point, the disciples have already witnessed with their own eyes. The kinds of miracles that Jesus has done, the healings and the casting out of demons. In fact, then entrusting the disciples with the same miraculous power. And so what we're going to see in the next several passages as we study through the book of Mark is Jesus calling the disciples to an even deeper faith, saying, yeah, I see that you trust in me this much. Well, guess what? You got to trust even more. I see that you see that I'm somebody important in God's kingdom. You need to see that I am the kingdom. And so he's going to call upon them to have faith in deeper and deeper and seemingly more and more ridiculous ways. But it's so that they can see the fullness of who he is. And here's the first step. Thousands of people. We're going to come to learn 5,000 men, which could mean 20 to 25,000 people total. And Jesus says to his disciples, you feed them. And that was not supposed to be a call upon the disciples' ingenuity or creativity. Well, what can you come up with? That was a call upon their faith. Who do you think I am? Well, the disciples fail this first test. They said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? The denarii was a day's wage for a common laborer. So they essentially said, Jesus, we're going to go and find 7 months' wages worth of bread to feed all these people? I don't understand what you're saying, Jesus. I think this is kind of a little bit of a smart alecky response. Not a good place to put yourself in, probably. Verse 38. And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. So we learn from the other Gospels that this is actually a little boy's sack lunch, essentially. And this word that is translated to loaves is probably more accurately like rolls. Like we would think of those Hawaiian rolls? Those are the best, right? That's more of the size of what we're thinking. I'm not thinking of like bunny bread loaves here. We're thinking of Hawaiian rolls. It's a little boy's sack lunch. And that's saying, that's all we have, Jesus, is a little boy's sack lunch. So can we send them away now? Verse 39. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. And he broke the loaves and he gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. So Jesus here does something that only God can do. He breaks, what was the law of the conservation of mass? Which law is that? I don't know, second, third, whatever. He creates something out of nothing, which is pretty impressive, not something I can do. If you're a good cook, you can stretch a meal farther than it's supposed to go, but this is quite another thing altogether. He takes a little boy's sack lunch, and he multiplies it to feed 20,000 people, and when they're done, there's more left over than when they began. Now, this is not just a miracle to feed some hungry stomachs. This, instead, is supposed to be a very clear indication of who Jesus is, what kind of a king he is. It's supposed to immediately call to mind for the people another time when God miraculously fed his people in the wilderness. But that's what the word desolate place means. It's very literally the wilderness. And there's another time that the people of God would have immediately remembered when they were in the wilderness, and God provided bread when there should not have been bread. And that is when God, after the Exodus, the people were wandering in the wilderness, in Exodus 16, that God provided the manna, the miraculous bread that appeared for the people of God, and it sustained them. And this would instantly have pointed the people and confirmed to them that Jesus is the fulfillment of the messianic prophecy in Deuteronomy 18, that there would be one day another prophet like Moses. And they should immediately go, here he is. The prophet like Moses that we've been waiting now for thousands of years. Here he is. He's finally come. The one who can bring, through God, manna in the wilderness. Here he is. There's all kinds of indications that there's parallels here between the book of Exodus and this account. The grouping of the peoples according to hundreds and 50s. The fact that there were 12 baskets full, one for every tribe of Israel. And now the manna in the wilderness. And so what kind of a king is Jesus? Well, lastly, we see that Christ has compassion for your empty stomach. Christ has compassion for your empty stomach. Now, I don't mean to brag, but you might have noticed that's 3 points with double alliteration. You don't see that every Sunday. That's all I'm saying, all right? Anyway, okay, God here showed up in an incredible way, and he showed his compassion for all of who we are. That he doesn't just care for our physical needs, he does. But more than that, he doesn't just care for our mental well-being, he does. And he doesn't just care for our spiritual eternity, he does. He cares for all of those things together. That's the kind of king he is. That's the kind of shepherd he is. That we as his sheep are extremely needy. And yet he is able to provide for all of our needs. And so what kind of a king is Jesus? Well, I'm sure in this day that they were skeptical of politicians' big promises just like we are today. Politicians, if they're good at anything, they're good at making promises and then not fulfilling them. But that is not the kind of king that Jesus was. He didn't just give wise teachings that promised goodness for his people. He then delivered on those teachings. Can you imagine how much more impactful it was for Jesus to say to the people, I can give you eternal life, and then to turn around and to perform this miracle to prove his power, to prove what is behind his words, that he is God in the flesh. And so, unlike King Herod that we studied about last week, who gave an empty promise to his daughter Salome. Oh, up to half of my kingdom. Ask for whatever you wish, except I can't actually give you any part of my kingdom because I'm not a true king. Unlike King Herod, who made empty promises, Jesus speaks with truth, and he speaks with power, and he speaks with authority. And anytime he speaks, we can trust in his words, we can believe in them, and we can follow them with our lives. Because not all kings are the same. Not all politicians are the same. There is at least one who has never made an empty promise, and his name is King Jesus. So just think again about the difference between the dinner banquet that King Herod threw that we studied last week and this dinner banquet that King Jesus has just thrown for these 25,000 people. How different can they be? Well, in Herod's banquet, only the influential were invited. But in Jesus' banquet, all were invited. In Herod's banquet, only the rich were fed, but in Jesus' banquet, all were fed. In Herod's banquet, the ungodly exploited each other for wicked means, but in Jesus' banquet, the godly were given godly wisdom. In Herod's banquet, it ended with the death of a godly man, and at Jesus' banquet, it ends with him proving that he has the power to give eternal life. And here's the more astounding thing. Jesus invites you to his banquet. He invites you into his kingdom. He offers for you rest for your soul. He calls you to be one of his people, to enter into his kingdom, to follow him with your life, so that he can care for you, all of who you are, your exhausted spirit, your eternal soul, and your empty stomach. This is the kind of king that Jesus is, because he's not just a king. He's also a shepherd. And so would you answer his call? He calls to you to enter into his kingdom and to follow him with your life. Would you answer? Father, we are thankful for your perfect and holy word.